Just before midnight, November 14th, 1942. The black water off Guadalcanal. A lookout on the battleship Kirishima swept his binoculars across the darkness and felt something close to calm. This was his ocean, not the daylight sea where American planes came screaming down out of the sun, but the night, the deep tropical black where no plane flew and no radar mattered, where the war came down to sharp eyes and steady nerves, and the finest torpedoes in the world. His Navy had spent years training for exactly this. Fighting in the dark was not something the Japanese endured. It was something they were better at than anyone alive. He had every reason to be confident. For months, on these very waters, Japanese warships had come out of the night and butchered the Americans, again and again, and slipped away before dawn. The night belonged to Japan. Everyone knew it. The Americans knew it best of all. Then, out of the perfect darkness where there was nothing, no ship, no searchlight, no muzzle flash he could find, the sea around Kirishima erupted. Shells the size of small cars came down out of the black and walked across his ship, and the great battleship staggered under blows from a gun he could not see, fired by an enemy who should have been blind. There was no target to shoot back at. There was only the dark, and the dark was killing them. Before I get into it, a little backstory. My dad fought in the Second World War, and growing up he told me stories about it all the time. And the more I listened, the more one thing fascinated me. Not what our side did, but what it looked like from the other side. The men who were supposed to win, what they saw, what they were told, and the moment they realized none of it was true. So that's how I like to tell these stories, through the eyes of the enemy who couldn't stop us. And now here I am, passing on the stories I learned to you. To understand the horror on Kirishima's bridge that night, you have to understand the pride that put her there. By late 1942, the whole Pacific War had narrowed down to one miserable island, Guadalcanal, a patch of jungle and mud in the Solomon Islands that neither side had cared about a year earlier, and that both sides were now bleeding themselves white to hold. The key to the island was a single airfield the Americans had seized and named Henderson Field. As long as American planes flew from that strip, they ruled the daylight sea around Guadalcanal, and every Japanese attempt to land troops and supplies was torn apart from the air. So Japan had learned to own the night instead. When the sun went down and the American planes went to sleep, Japanese warships came racing down the slot between the islands, and in the dark they were magnificent. Their crews had trained for night battle until it was instinct. Their lookouts had eyes that seemed almost inhuman, spotting ships miles away by starlight. And they carried a weapon the Americans did not even understand yet, a torpedo so fast, so far-reaching, and so powerful that it could kill from distances the Americans thought were safe. Night after night, in battle after battle, around those islands, Japanese squadrons had ambushed American forces in the dark and shattered them, sunk their cruisers, and vanished before morning. This was the confidence Kirishima carried into the black water that night. She was part of a powerful force under Vice Admiral Kondo, sent south with one clear mission: steam in under cover of darkness and pound Henderson Field into rubble with the heavy guns of a battleship, so that at last a convoy of troop transports could land the men who would take the island. It was a mission built entirely on the belief that the night was Japan's, that in the dark, the Americans could not find them, could not aim, could not fight. That belief had been true for months. It was about to get thousands of men killed, because waiting for them in that same darkness was something the Japanese had not planned for. 2 American battleships and an admiral who had stopped trusting his eyes. His name was Willis Lee, and he was not a typical battleship admiral. He was a gunnery expert, a quiet, bespectacled man obsessed with a new technology that most old sailors still did not fully trust: radar. The ability to see in the dark, not with the eye, but with a machine, a beam of radio waves that reached out into the blackness, touched the enemy, and came back to paint his exact position on a screen. Range, bearing, course, all of it in total darkness, without a single light, without ever seeing the enemy ship at all. Lee understood what this meant better than almost anyone. The Japanese had built their whole night doctrine around human senses, around superb lookouts, and years of training. Lee had a machine that made all of that irrelevant. His ships could stand off in the dark, invisible, and shoot with cold mechanical precision at an enemy who had no idea they were even there. The Japanese had spent a decade learning to see in the dark. The Americans had simply built something that made the dark not matter. Lee brought his 2 battleships, Washington and South Dakota, and a handful of destroyers into the waters north of Guadalcanal that night and settled in to wait. And at first, the night went exactly the way the Japanese expected it to. The battle opened with the smaller ships, and it opened badly for the Americans. The Japanese found the American destroyers first, and in a few brutal minutes did to them what they had done to so many others in these waters. Torpedoes and shells came out of the dark, and American destroyers blew apart, burned, and went down. 2 were sunk outright, others crippled. To the men on Kirishima, watching American ships die in the night, it was the old familiar story. The night was theirs. The enemy was blundering and blind. Everything they believed was being confirmed in fire on the black water. Then it got even better for them, or so it seemed. One of the 2 American battleships, South Dakota, suffered a disaster that had nothing to do with enemy fire. Deep inside the ship, an electrical failure cascaded through her systems, and in an instant she lost power. Her radar went dark. Her gun directors froze. The most modern battleship in the world went, in a heartbeat, blind and half-mute in the middle of a night battle. And then, to finish the nightmare, she drifted into a position where the Japanese searchlights found her and locked on. For the Japanese gunners, it was a gift. A giant American battleship suddenly lit up against the darkness, unable to shoot back properly. They poured fire into her. Shell after shell slammed into South Dakota, wrecking her upper works, starting fires, killing men at their stations. On the Japanese ships, the certainty must have been total. They were winning. Another American disaster in the dark. Another night that belonged to Japan. And in their triumph, in the glare of their own searchlights fixed on the burning South Dakota, they made the one mistake that would kill them. They forgot about the second battleship. Because while every Japanese eye and every Japanese gun was fixed on the blazing target in front of them, USS Washington had been sitting silently in the darkness, unseen, unlit, and utterly patient, watching all of it through her radar. Admiral Lee and his gunnery officers had been tracking the Japanese ships the entire time, not with their eyes, but with the machine. On their screens, in a quiet room lit by soft glow, the enemy ships were bright, clear marks. Range, bearing, course. Washington knew exactly where Kirishima was, down to the yard, and Kirishima did not know Washington existed. Lee held his fire and let the picture build. And when he had it, when the great battleship Kirishima sat clearly on his radar at a range of just a few miles, silhouetted in the light of her own searchlights, as she hammered the crippled South Dakota, he gave the order. Washington's main battery, 9 16-inch guns, each one able to throw a shell weighing more than a small car, swung out into the darkness toward an enemy the gunners had never seen with their own eyes, and opened fire. What happened next lasted about 7 minutes, and it ended the career of the Imperial Japanese battleship in these waters forever. The first salvo came down on Kirishima out of nowhere. To the men aboard her, there was no warning at all, no flash on the horizon they could trace, because Washington was too far off in the dark and the night swallowed her gun flashes. There was only the sudden, world-ending arrival of shells, and then another salvo, and another, coming with a speed and an accuracy that made no sense to men who understood how night battles were supposed to work. Washington's radar-directed guns walked their fire onto Kirishima and simply stayed there, salvo after salvo tearing the battleship apart from a distance at which the Japanese could not even find their attacker. In those few minutes, Washington struck Kirishima with around 9 of those enormous 16-inch shells and dozens of smaller ones. The hits ripped through her. They wrecked her steering. They jammed her rudder so that the great ship could only turn helplessly in a circle. They started fires that spread through her, knocked out her guns, and killed men by the score. The pride of Japan's night force, a battleship crewed by men who had trained their whole lives to rule the darkness, was reduced in about the length of a single song to a burning, circling wreck, beaten by an enemy her crew never laid eyes on. Think about the horror of that for the men aboard. They were the masters of night combat. They had come to do the killing as they had done so many times before. and they died without ever seeing the ship that killed them. There was no duel. There was no enemy to aim at. There was only the darkness they had always trusted, and death pouring out of it with machine precision, and the slow, sickening understanding that their night, the thing they had built their entire Navy around, had somehow been taken away from them and turned into a weapon against them. Kirishima never recovered, with her steering destroyed and fires raging through her. Unable to fight or steer or escape, she was finished. In the small hours of that morning, her own crew scuttled her, and the great battleship rolled over and went down into the black water north of the island, taking many of her men with her. She was the first Japanese battleship ever sunk by American gunfire, and the ship that killed her, Washington, came through the whole night almost untouched. She had fought a battleship duel in the dark and had barely been scratched, because her enemy had spent the fight shooting at someone else and never even found her. The mission failed completely. Henderson Field was never bombarded. The airfield lived, the American planes flew again at dawn, and the convoy of troops that was supposed to win Guadalcanal was caught in the daylight and slaughtered. The battle that was meant to be another triumph of the Japanese night became instead the moment the tide turned for good. After that night, Japan would never again seriously threaten to take the island back. The long retreat had begun, and it had begun in the dark under the guns of a ship the Japanese could not see. When you sit with what happened to Kirishima, the lesson is the same quiet, brutal one that ran through the whole Pacific War. The Japanese sailor was not beaten because he was a coward or because he lacked skill. He was, man for man, perhaps the finest night fighter the world had ever produced. He had better torpedoes. He had better trained lookouts. In the pure old test of eyes and nerve in the dark, he may well have been the best there was, and none of it mattered because the Americans had simply refused to fight that test. They had looked at the one arena where Japan was unbeatable, the night, and instead of trying to become better night fighters, they had built a machine that erased the night altogether. Radar did not care how good your lookouts were. It did not care how many years you had trained. It saw in the dark with a cold electric eye, and it handed an ordinary American gunnery officer the power to kill the finest ship in the enemy fleet without ever seeing her. That was the pattern over and over. Japan brought spirit and skill and a decade of brilliant training to the fight. America brought a machine that made the spirit and the skill beside the point. The masters of the night met an enemy who had turned the night off, and they died in the darkness they had always called their own, still searching the black water for a ship that had been watching them the entire time. The lookout on Kirishima had felt calm at the start, staring into that darkness. It was his ocean. He had been told that in the night no one could touch them. He learned the truth in 7 minutes from an enemy he never saw, firing from a place his eyes could not reach. The Empire had trained him to be the master of the dark. It never told him that the dark had stopped being on his side.